Welcome to another conversation in the ICAS American Voices Initiative. My name is Alec Chance with the Institute for China-America Studies. Today I'm joined by Matthew Goodman, Senior Advisor for Asian Economics at CSIS. Matthew, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
At this point in time, what in your opinion are the most significant issues in the U.S.-China economic relationship?
Well, this is a huge and still growing relationship. We have something like $700 billion of trade both ways, increases in investment in both directions, already sizable stocks of investment, and those are growing, particularly Chinese investment in the U.S. And overall, I think the trajectory is still very much upward and strong. But there is a growing number of areas of tension in the relationship and the economic relationship, which I think are worrisome about where we're headed longer term, particularly because economics has really been the underpinning of the overall relationship since we have issues on the other side or on other aspects of our relations, whether political or security or others. So if the economic pillar is weakening, that's troubling.
What do you think are the most difficult near-term challenges?
Well, I think that there are a couple of challenges. One is that growth is slowing in both countries, and I think that's creating less of a natural force for convergence between the two economies, and both of us have our own challenges in that regard. But I think more significantly, there are some growing trade and investment related frictions. Particularly, there is a growing concern among American businesses who have invested heavily in China over the last 30 years. The conditions there are getting a lot less friendly. In fact, surveys by the American Chamber of Commerce in Beijing have shown that there's a significant increase in discomfort and a sense of not being welcome. And that's a result partly of natural economic forces because growth is slowing. Labor is getting more expensive, but I also think it's because of policy shifts in China. There's some pre-existing barriers like equity investment caps that are still sort of grating, but on top of that you have now concerns about regulatory transparency and use of laws like the anti-monopoly law in a way that's perceived as discriminatory. And then you have a series of steps that the Chinese government is taking to, broadly speaking, promote indigenous innovation. That term has been sort of officially renounced, but there's still policies underway to try to indigenize the innovative capabilities of China. And on one level, that's not surprising or a problem, but in specific ways, from the point of view of American business, seems to be coming somewhat at their expense. Their technology may be being stolen through intellectual property or cyber-enabled theft. There are controls on the flow of data in China that are growing. There are concerns about champions being given favored position in innovation and other areas in China, and that is coming to the exclusion of foreign firms. So I think that's the real nub of it, is that the investment climate in China is becoming is being perceived as less friendly.
So let's talk about the bilateral investment treaty. Can you give us a status update on the BIT negotiations?
Well, the U.S. and China have been negotiating a bilateral investment arrangement for many years, I think, and it's had numerous ebbs and flows. It continues. There have been a couple of deadlines in the last year or two that have been missed for completing this agreement, and it's still underway and being negotiated, and both sides indicate that they want to get it done as soon as possible. The reality is that I think there are still some pretty big gaps in positions, particularly on the issue of what sectors are open to foreign investment in China. That's certainly the U.S. Problem with where we are in the negotiations. And there's this so-called negative list approach, which China has agreed to in principle, which means that all investment is open except where explicitly ruled out or limited in some way. And the U.S. perception is that the Chinese list is way too long of things that are on that negative list, and it effectively doesn't really change the status quo very much. So that's probably the nub of the sore point. There are some other issues, but I think that issue is still under negotiation. I think it's going to be a while before it gets completed.
Let's switch to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP. In a recent piece, you echoed President Obama's concerns that TPP is about the U.S. writing the rules for Asia-Pacific trade rather than China. What is at stake in this issue?
Sure. Well, the point that I usually make is that there are really three objectives the U.S. has in TPP. One is pure economic and commercial benefit of more open markets and opportunities to export and grow and create jobs. So that's number one. And in that category, I would say, TPP is a significant agreement. It's not probably going to, significantly change the trajectory of U.S. economic growth, but it's significant. Numbers like $60 billion of extra GDP when it's fully implemented. The second category is pure strategic, the sense that the United States has to be embedded in Asia as a Pacific power, but not an Asian power, through the things that we do out there. And some of those things are, many of those things are military security related, some are diplomatic, some are cultural, but the economic leg is absolutely critical to this story. And most Asian countries want the United States engaged economically, and so TPP is a way of showing our commitment economically. So it's an important strategic complement to the rest of the so-called rebalance strategy of President Obama, although even if he hadn't come up with that term, this strategic impulse would be there. And then the third area, the one that I was highlighting in my recent piece, is what I call strategic economic objectives, which are that the U.S. has been a champion of the rules-based order for the last 70 years, since World War II. And that order has largely benefited everyone, the United States, Europe, Japan, and China, by creating institutions and rules that produce predictability and the sanctity of contracts and knowledge that you can invest somewhere without fear of nationalization. I mean, there are a bunch of different dimensions to these rules. Those rules are out of date in some cases because we now have a lot of commerce being done digitally and in other ways, and it's important for those rules to be updated. And ultimately, there are some key areas, particularly where the U.S. has significant comparative advantage, like the digital economy, where the American approach to rulemaking is important for U.S. interests, and in an enlightened, self-interested way. Also, we think good for everyone else. And so there is a lot at stake. That was the point I was trying to make for the United States. And on some of those issues, those key issues that are embedded in the TPP agreement, China has a somewhat different view. They have a view, for example, on the internet that is sometimes called internet sovereignty, where each country should be able to sort of control the content and the way the internet works. The U.S. believes in an open and sort of multi-stakeholder internet. So TPP is designed to enhance that approach. And so there are other examples. The role of the state generally in the economy is something that the United States is concerned about and feels that if you've got state-owned enterprises, they have to behave like private companies. Or labor rights are important to the United States, environmental standards. So I think that's the point that President Obama was trying to make when he started his pitch for TPP in the State of the Union speech and said, we write the rules, not China, and we need to continue to do that. Which was a little eyebrow raising. It was a controversial way to put it, but I think what I was trying to do is to explain that there are different approaches, and from a U.S. interest point of view, we want to expand and extend those high standard rules to those sorts of areas of economic endeavor.
Many Americans have noted that OBOR might create a regional or even a global dynamic in which, quote unquote, all roads lead to Beijing. What is at stake in these concerns?
Well, I think that there are real economic drivers behind this. As I say, there is a big need for infrastructure across the Asia-Pacific. I think that China and other investors in infrastructure are are responding to that need. In China's case, there are other economic drivers behind this, including trying to keep their construction companies busy when they've sort of reached the limits of capacity within China. But I do think there's also a geostrategic piece to this. Clearly, China wants to, understandably, stabilize its near abroad, ensure that there is a, at a minimum, a healthy economic interchange, and maybe, some greater political receptivity to China's role in the region. Although that's a double-edged sword, because some of the stuff they're doing raises some hackles. For example, when I was in Kazakhstan, there was a protest across the road, an unprecedented protest in Almaty, about Chinese ability to procure land in Kazakhstan, not actually to buy it, but to have a long-term lease. And that was very controversial. So you can see there are going to be some antibodies that are created as China tries to do some of this. But I think it's not a surprise to think that China would be wanting to have influence geopolitically in the region, and I think that's partly what this is about.
What are your thoughts on the view that China is creating a set of parallel institutions to the Bretton Woods system?
So look, I think there's no question that China feels that the kind of the seating arrangements in the existing institutions, the so-called Bretton Woods institutions, World Bank, ADB, IMF, the broad family, does not reflect the reality of today's global economy, and that China and other emerging markets should have more voice. They've not been fully satisfied in that regard in those institutions, so they've had an impulse to set up their own institutions and drive those. But you take the AIIB, the head of the AIIB, Jin Lichun, has said many times that he intends this bank to be lean, clean, and green, which means it'll be efficient, non-corrupt, and environmentally sound. And the US has no argument with that if it does those things. I think there's some questions based on China's track record about whether it's actually going to do those things. But so I think, to the extent this is contributing more to global public goods or regional public goods in Asia, I think that's welcome for the United States, and I don't think it's inconsistent with what the U.S. Has done or wants to do. And I think it's important for people, when they analyze this, to separate the issues about the governance or the seating arrangements and who gets to call the shots versus the substantive content of, how do you invest in infrastructure? What are the rules? What are the standards of environmental and social standards, debt sustainability standards? Those are the substantive things. And on those fronts, I don't think China's offered a particularly new approach to those things. They may have one, but they haven't demonstrated that they intend to roll out a new approach.
How likely is it that the United States could join the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank in the future?
I don't think the United States is going to be in a position to join the AIIB anytime soon. I mean, if you look at the politics in our Congress, it was very hard to get approval to the IMF reforms that were almost a rounding error in terms of actual fiscal impact in the United States, and yet it was very controversial. To join the AIIB at anything like our level of what our share should be is going to cost a lot more than that, and it's more importantly perhaps going to be politically sensitive, given that it's a Chinese-led bank. So I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. But the U.S. could be an observer in the bank, and I do think it will want to encourage, as it's already done, collaboration between the AIIB and the existing banks like the World Bank and the ADB.
Do you see any opportunities for OBOR to facilitate cooperation between China and the United States?
Well, I think there are a number of levels on which the U.S. and China could collaborate on this infrastructure push in Asia. I mean, for one thing, to the extent procurement by Chinese entities when they build these projects is open to American bidders. We have some good companies like Bechtel and GE and various companies in one way or another involved in broadly defined infrastructure. If the procurement is open to them, that would be one way to collaborate. Another would be, and vice versa, to the extent the U.S. is procuring things. I think also the banks, as I mentioned, the AIIB could collaborate with the World Bank, the ADB, where the U.S. has the majority, or the most shares, not a majority, has the most shares of any country. So it has an ability to direct or help direct those banks to collaborate. I think that's an opportunity. And then I think maybe this is maybe a new thing, but not entirely new, but there could be more focus on working together on some of those standards, whether through those multilateral development banks or maybe through some new forum or through the G20 or something where they could get together and say, well, what is the right environmental standard when you make a loan for a dam or a road? There is some of that conversation, but it's amazing how different these different institutions approach even that issue. Even within the United States, we approach those things differently. So I think there's scope for a conversation about what are the right standards and safeguards when you do infrastructure lending.
So finally, I'd like to ask for your long-term forecast for the U.S.-China economic relationship. Are you more of an optimist or more of a pessimist?
Well, in the short term, I'm a little worried about our economic relationship. I think there are some tensions that are potentially going to get even worse, and we're going to have to be very proactive, to use an unfortunate term. We're going to have to be very proactive in managing those areas of tension and really taking them on head on. And I think that's going to be a little problematic. Over the longer term, I'm far more optimistic about the relationship because I think China, for its own reasons, really has to transform its own domestic economy and rebalance it towards consumption and services and domestic demand. And to the extent it does that, rather than the old model of heavy investment and export-led growth, and to the extent it does that and opens up opportunities for Americans to participate in serving those consumers and services, and so by providing services that we're good at, like financial services or healthcare services or energy-related products and services, I think that will help to rectify not only the calculated trade imbalance, but will also create a better, more positive relationship. And then I also think that long term there should be an impulse towards liberalization in China. I think in both the economic and even political spheres. I don't think that's just simply going to be because they're more middle class people who demand more freedom. I think that's been proven to be at least something that's not going to happen in the short term. But the imperative of shifting to this more consumption and services-led economy, it's hard to get there, and to a more value-added, more innovative economy. It's hard to get there without giving people a little more say in their own economic destiny, at least, if not in politics. So I think as China moves in that direction, and I'm not predicting that in the very short term, but as they move in that direction, I think that it would make for better relations, just as Taiwan and Korea moving in that direction in the 80s and 90s, I think strengthened our relations with those countries. So in the long term, I'm much more optimistic about U.S.-China economic relations over that sort of 20 to 25 year period. But we've got a lot of difficult issues we've got to work through in the meantime.
Well, Matthew, thanks for taking time out of your busy schedule to talk with me today.
Thank you very much for having me.